"Sir, stand up and come with me. You are not authorized to remain in this cabin." The words landed like a thunderclap across the quiet first-class section of Horizon Air Flight 271, and for a moment, every conversation stopped. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Eyes lifted above tablets and newspapers. The soft hum of pre-flight boarding suddenly felt sharp, electric, charged with something nobody could quite name. At seat 2A sat 17-year-old Jordan Carter, dressed in a plain navy hoodie, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. Nothing about him looked unusual. Nothing about him looked threatening. Yet Air Marshal Richard Collins stood over him with the certainty of a man who believed he had already reached his verdict. Jordan slowly looked up from his phone. His expression never changed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't nervous. He simply looked confused. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Richard folded his arms. "The problem is that you're sitting in a seat you don't belong in." A murmur drifted through the cabin. Across the aisle, a businessman in an expensive gray suit smirked. A woman near the front exchanged a glance with her husband. Nobody knew what was happening, but many had already decided who they believed. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Jordan Carter. Jordan reached into his pocket and calmly handed over his boarding pass. Richard barely glanced at it before returning it. "I need you to come with me." The teenager frowned slightly. "My ticket was scanned at the gate." "That's not what I said," Richard replied. His voice cut through the cabin like a blade. Nearby, flight attendant Nicole Harris stepped closer. Her smile was polite, but her eyes weren't. "Sir, please cooperate so we can avoid delaying the flight." Jordan looked around. The seat assignment clearly displayed 2A. His name was printed on the boarding pass. Everything was exactly where it should have been. Yet somehow, he felt the room moving against him. The first-class cabin no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like a courtroom. Every glance became a judgment. Every whisper sounded like a verdict. A man 3 rows back chuckled under his breath. Kid probably wandered into the wrong section. A few passengers laughed quietly. Jordan heard them. He heard all of it. Still, he remained seated. Calm, respectful, controlled. That seemed to irritate Richard even more. Some people expected confrontation. Some people expected anger. Jordan gave them neither. "I've shown my ticket," Jordan said softly. "Can someone explain what's wrong?" Nicole exchanged a quick look with Richard. It lasted less than a second, but Jordan noticed it. So did a woman sitting in row 3 named Emily Brooks. She lowered her tablet and watched more carefully. Something about this didn't make sense. The boarding process continued around them, but the energy had shifted. The aircraft no longer felt like it was preparing for departure. It felt like it was waiting for something much bigger. Richard took a step closer. "Last chance, son. Stand up." The word son wasn't friendly. It wasn't kind. It carried something heavier. Something familiar. Jordan slowly locked his phone and slipped it into his pocket. Around him, dozens of strangers watched as though they were about to witness a problem being removed. None of them knew they were actually witnessing the beginning of one. Jordan Carter rose from seat 2A without argument. The movement surprised several passengers more than any protest would have. People expected resistance. They expected excuses. They expected the teenager to become the story they had already written in their minds. Instead, Jordan simply stood, straightened the sleeve of his navy hoodie, and looked directly at Air Marshal Richard Collins. "I am cooperating," he said quietly. His voice carried no fear and no anger. That calmness unsettled the people around him. Richard gestured toward the front of the aircraft. "This way." Jordan nodded once. The first-class cabin watched as he stepped into the aisle. A businessman near the window shook his head. "Kids these days think they can get away with anything." His companion chuckled. Neither of them knew a single thing about Jordan. Neither of them cared. Nicole Harris followed a few steps behind, maintaining the polished smile airlines trained into their employees. Yet her eyes kept drifting toward Jordan as though she expected him to reveal some hidden problem at any second. He never did. The cabin doors remained open. Boarding continued. Families found their seats. Carry-on bags disappeared into overhead bins. Life moved forward around Jordan as if he were an inconvenience that needed to be cleared before departure. Emily Brooks watched everything from row 3. Something about the situation refused to settle in her mind. She had flown hundreds of times. She knew what confusion looked like. She knew what suspicious behavior looked like. Jordan looked like neither. He looked like a teenager who had boarded his flight and taken the seat printed on his ticket. As Jordan reached the galley near the front of the aircraft, Richard stopped him. "Wait here." Jordan folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Can someone explain what this is about?" Richard glanced at Nicole before answering. "There are questions regarding your seating assignment." Jordan nodded slowly. "Then there should be answers too." The words were respectful, but they landed harder than anyone expected. Nicole shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, neither of them responded immediately. Jordan remained standing beside the galley wall. The bright cabin lights reflected off the polished surfaces around him. He felt dozens of eyes still following him from the first-class section. He had experienced that feeling before. Not on airplanes, not in airports, just in life. The feeling of entering a room and somehow becoming the most noticeable person there without doing anything at all. At 17, Jordan had learned something many adults never mastered. Sometimes the loudest statement was refusing to become the version of yourself other people expected. So he stayed calm. He checked the time on his phone. 3:42 in the afternoon. The aircraft was scheduled to depart in less than 20 minutes. Somewhere several states away, boardrooms were filling with executives, meetings were beginning, and billion-dollar decisions were being made. Jordan was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about getting home. Yet as he stood beside the galley under the watchful eyes of strangers, a strange feeling settled over him. The flight had not left the gate, but somehow, something much larger had already begun moving. The atmosphere inside the aircraft continued to tighten like a cable pulled one notch too far. What had started as a simple boarding delay was slowly transforming into something else. Something larger. Something uncomfortable. Jordan remained near the front galley while passengers settled into their seats. Yet the attention never left him. It followed him the way a spotlight follows a performer across a stage. Richard Collins stood a few feet away speaking quietly into a company radio. His posture was confident, almost relaxed, as though the outcome had already been decided. Nicole Harris reviewed something on a tablet before glancing back toward Jordan. Every few seconds their eyes returned to him. Not to the businessman complaining about overhead bin space. Not to the passenger arguing about a carry-on bag. Just Jordan. Emily Brooks noticed that too. She leaned slightly into the aisle and watched the interaction unfold. The more she observed, the less sense it made. Finally, she stood and approached a nearby flight attendant. "Excuse me," she asked politely. "Did that young man do something wrong?" The attendant hesitated. "I am not authorized to discuss passenger matters." Emily nodded. "That usually means no." The attendant quickly looked away. Across the cabin, whispers multiplied. A middle-aged man near row 4 folded his newspaper. "If security is involved, there has to be a reason." A woman beside him shrugged. "Maybe." The word hung in the air. Maybe. Nobody actually knew anything. Yet assumptions spread faster than facts. Jordan heard pieces of every conversation. He heard the doubts. He heard the speculation. Most of all, he heard the certainty people carried despite having no information at all. He checked the time again. 3:47. The departure window was getting closer. Richard finally stepped toward him. "We are still verifying information." Jordan nodded calmly. "What information?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That is not something I need to discuss with you right now." Jordan tilted his head slightly. "You are verifying information about me without telling me what it is?" Richard did not answer. The silence answered for him. Nearby, Nicole stepped forward. "Sir, we simply need your cooperation." Jordan gave a small smile. "I have cooperated the entire time." That statement landed harder than any argument could have. Because it was true. He had followed every instruction. He had remained respectful. He had not raised his voice once. Yet somehow he was still standing in the galley while everyone else occupied the seats they paid for. Emily crossed her arms. The picture becoming clear was not the one Richard and Nicole seemed to believe they were painting. It was another picture entirely. A picture of a teenager being treated differently while nobody could clearly explain why. The cabin crew sensed the shift. Passengers were beginning to ask questions. The quiet agreement that had existed 20 minutes earlier was fading. Doubt was replacing it. And doubt was dangerous because once people started questioning a story, they often discovered there was no story at all. Jordan remained calm. But somewhere beneath that calmness, a realization was beginning to form. This was no longer about a seat assignment. This was about something much deeper. And everyone on board was about to find out just how expensive a bad assumption could become. Emily Brooks had spent 15 years as a corporate compliance attorney, and one lesson had followed her through every boardroom, courtroom, and negotiation table she had ever entered. When people possessed facts, they shared them. When they possessed assumptions, they hid behind vague language. As she watched the situation unfolding near the front galley, she heard plenty of vague language. Questions regarding information, verification procedures, passenger concerns. Yet nobody had presented a single concrete reason why Jordan Carter was standing there instead of sitting in seat 2A. That bothered her. More importantly, it bothered other passengers. 2. The shift happened slowly at first. A man across the aisle lowered his laptop. A woman near the window removed her headphones. The audience that had once quietly accepted the situation was beginning to pay attention. Emily stood and walked toward the front of the cabin. Richard Collins immediately noticed. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." Emily smiled politely. "I will in a moment." Richard's expression hardened. "This is an active security matter." Emily looked directly at him. "Then surely there is a security concern you can explain." Richard did not answer. Emily nodded as if he had confirmed something important. She turned toward Jordan. "Young man, was that your assigned seat?" Jordan looked at her. "Yes, ma'am." "Did your boarding pass scan normally at the gate?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did anyone stop you before you sat down?" "No, ma'am." Emily folded her arms. The answers came quickly because they were simple. Truth usually did. Around them, several passengers listened openly now. Nicole Harris stepped forward. "Ma'am, this conversation is not appropriate." Emily glanced at her. Neither is removing someone from first class without explaining why. The words hung in the air. Nobody immediately challenged them. Even Nicole seemed unsure how to respond. Jordan remained calm through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not try to defend himself. He simply answered the questions asked of him. That calmness was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Emily noticed something else. Jordan's boarding pass was still partially visible in his hand. She pointed toward it. "May I see it?" Jordan handed it over. Emily studied the document carefully. Seat 2A. First class. Name matching identification. Flight number correct. Departure time correct. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Emily slowly looked up. "This is a valid boarding pass." Several nearby passengers exchanged glances. One man quietly muttered, "Then why is he standing up here?" Nobody answered. Because nobody could. Richard stepped closer. "Ma'am, you are not authorized to review internal procedures." Emily handed the boarding pass back to Jordan. "And you are not authorized to invent them." A few passengers smiled. Others nodded. The mood inside the cabin had changed again. What had started as suspicion was becoming skepticism. What had started as isolation was becoming support. Jordan noticed it too. For the first time since leaving his seat, he was no longer standing alone. Emily returned to her row, but the effect remained. Questions were spreading through the aircraft faster than explanations. And questions were dangerous because they forced people to confront something uncomfortable. The possibility that the teenager standing in the galley was never the problem at all. The tension finally reached a point where silence could no longer hide it. The aircraft doors were still open. Departure time had come and gone. Passengers checked watches, glanced at phones, and exchanged increasingly frustrated looks. Yet nobody seemed more unsettled than Richard Collins and Nicole Harris. The questions were multiplying, and the answers were not. Richard stepped toward Jordan once more. His voice remained controlled, but the confidence that had filled it earlier was beginning to thin. "Sir, we are going to ask you to leave the aircraft while this matter is reviewed." A hush spread through the cabin. Even the passengers who had supported Richard at first now looked uncertain. Jordan studied him for a moment. "Leave the aircraft?" he asked calmly. "My ticket is valid. My identification is valid. My seat assignment is valid. What exactly is being reviewed?" Richard offered no direct answer. Instead, he repeated the request. "We need you to step off the plane." Jordan lowered his eyes briefly. Not in defeat. Not in surrender. More like someone recognizing a pattern he had hoped not to see again. A memory surfaced. He was 10 years old, standing inside an upscale electronics store while waiting for his father to finish a meeting nearby. An employee had followed him through every aisle, every display, every corner of the store. No accusations were ever spoken aloud, but the message had been clear. Another memory followed. Age 13. Walking through a gated neighborhood after visiting a classmate. A security guard stopped him and asked which house he belonged to. The other children were never questioned. Only him. Those moments had never become major incidents. They had simply settled into his memory like small stones dropped into deep water. Yet standing in the front galley now, Jordan felt those ripples again. Different location. Different faces. Same feeling. He slowly looked up. "You know," he said quietly, "nobody has explained what I did wrong." The statement landed across the cabin with surprising force. Because everyone knew it was true, Emily Brooks leaned forward in her seat. Several nearby passengers nodded. One elderly man removed his glasses and shook his head. "That is a fair question," he said aloud. Richard ignored him. Nicole glanced toward the cockpit as if searching for support that never arrived. The situation was slipping beyond procedures and policies. It was becoming something much harder to control. Public perception. Jordan reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone. Richard immediately noticed. "What are you doing?" Jordan looked at the screen. "Sending a message." "To who?" Jordan's expression never changed. "My father." Richard almost laughed. "Almost. This is not something your father can fix." A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Something about that statement felt premature. Jordan typed slowly. For simple words. No explanation. No emotion. No complaint. Just 4 words. "Dad." They did it. He stared at the message for a second before pressing send. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Around him, the cabin remained tense, uncertain, waiting. Nobody knew that a single notification had just appeared hundreds of miles away. Nobody knew that 4 quiet words were already moving toward people with far more authority than anyone on this aircraft could imagine. More than 800 miles away in downtown Atlanta, the executive conference room on the 42nd floor of Carter Global Holdings was completely silent. 12 executives sat around a polished walnut table reviewing quarterly forecasts worth billions of dollars. Large screens displayed market data. Financial projections glowed across the walls. Nobody expected the meeting to stop. Then Marcus Carter's phone vibrated. Once. He glanced down. 4 words. "Dad." They did it. Marcus did not immediately react. That was what unsettled the room. The people who worked closest to him knew something important about Marcus Carter. When a problem was small, he responded quickly. When a problem was serious, he became very still. The room watched as he read the message a second time, then a third. Finally, he locked the screen and stood. Every executive fell silent. "Reschedule the remainder of this meeting," he said calmly. No explanation. No discussion. The chief financial officer blinked. "For how long?" Marcus picked up his jacket. "Until I say otherwise." On the aircraft, Jordan remained standing near the galley. The cabin had grown restless. Passengers checked departure notifications. Flight attendants exchanged increasingly nervous looks. The delay was becoming difficult to explain. Richard Collins attempted to project confidence, but even he seemed aware that control was slipping away. Questions continued spreading through the cabin like cracks across glass. Emily Brooks was no longer the only passenger speaking up. "If his documents are valid, why is he still standing here?" someone asked from row 5. Another passenger nodded. "That is what I would like to know too." Nicole Harris forced a smile. "We appreciate your patience while we complete our review." The answer satisfied nobody. Jordan quietly checked his phone. No reply yet. That did not concern him. His father rarely answered messages immediately. He acted. A few moments later, the device vibrated once. Jordan glanced at the screen. 3 words. "I am handling it." That was all. No questions. No details. No panic. Just certainty. Jordan slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the country, Marcus entered a private elevator descending toward the Executive Transportation Center beneath headquarters. As the elevator doors closed, he made a single call. The line connected on the first ring. "This is Marcus Carter." The response on the other end became instantly formal. "Good afternoon, sir." Marcus stared at the elevator display. "Activate protocol review on Flight 271. Full passenger incident audit. Immediate. Priority." There was a brief pause. "Understood, sir." Effective immediately, Marcus ended the call. Back on the aircraft, nobody knew that internal systems were already waking up. Compliance teams, operations directors, legal analysts, Names that rarely appeared in public. Names with authority far beyond a single flight crew. The aircraft still sat at the gate. The passengers still believed they were waiting on a routine delay. Richard Collins still believed he was managing a difficult situation. But far beyond the cabin walls, decisions were already being made. And for the first time that afternoon, Jordan was no longer the only person quietly watching events unfold. At 4 o'clock Eastern Time, something unusual happened inside Horizon Air's National Operations Center. Monitors continued displaying flight paths. Controllers continued managing schedules. Thousands of employees continued doing their jobs. Yet across multiple departments, a priority alert suddenly appeared. Not a weather alert. Not a mechanical issue. An executive review directive. The kind of notification most employees never saw during their entire careers. Within minutes, managers were opening files. Passenger manifests were being reviewed. Gate records were being examined. Security logs were being pulled. The process moved quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. Back on the aircraft, nobody knew any of that. Richard Collins glanced at his watch. The delay was becoming difficult to justify. Passengers were openly frustrated now. Some demanded explanations. Others wanted departure updates. Emily Brooks watched the crew carefully. The confidence she had seen earlier was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Nicole Harris suddenly received a message on her company tablet. Her expression changed instantly. She read it once. Then again. Richard noticed. "What is it?" he asked. Nicole hesitated. "Operations wants additional verification." Richard frowned. "On what?" Nicole looked up. "Everything." The answer made no sense. At least not yet. A few moments later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Daniel Pierce stepped into the cabin. He had remained largely absent from the situation until now. That changed the moment he noticed the atmosphere around him. The passengers were watching. The crew looked nervous. Jordan remained standing calmly near the galley. Daniel approached Richard. "I need a word." The two men stepped aside. Their conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but whatever Daniel heard drained the color from his face. He immediately pulled out a company phone and dialed a number. No answer. He dialed another. This time someone picked up. Daniel listened without speaking. Then he looked directly toward Jordan. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken that afternoon. Nearby passengers noticed. Emily noticed. Even Jordan noticed. Something had shifted. Something significant. Daniel ended the call slowly. "Are you absolutely certain this is the passenger involved?" he asked Richard. Richard blinked. "Of course I am." Daniel looked unconvinced. Another notification appeared on Nicole's tablet. This one included a name. Her eyes widened. She stared at the screen as though it had become impossible to read. "Richard," she whispered, "you need to see this." He took the device. The moment he looked at it, the confidence disappeared from his face completely. For the first time all afternoon, Jordan saw uncertainty. Real uncertainty. Richard looked back toward him. Then back to the screen. Then back to Jordan again. The aircraft felt frozen. Every passenger sensed it. Every crew member felt it. Nobody knew what information had arrived, but everyone knew it mattered. Finally, Emily stood. "What is going on?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately, because the answer had just arrived. And the answer was bigger than a seat assignment, bigger than a delayed flight, bigger than anyone in the cabin had imagined. The teenager standing quietly near the galley was not simply a passenger. He was Jordan Carter, son of Marcus Carter, the chief executive officer whose signature sat at the top of the organizational chart governing the entire airline. And in that moment, the aircraft became so quiet that even breathing seemed loud. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Richard Collins stared at the tablet in his hands as though it had become something dangerous. Nicole Harris looked away entirely. Captain Daniel Pierce rubbed his forehead and immediately placed another call. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had transformed. Earlier, passengers had watched Jordan Carter with suspicion. Now they watched the crew. Questions had changed direction. Doubt had found a new target. Emily Brooks remained standing in the aisle. "So that is why nobody could explain anything," she said quietly. Nobody challenged her. Because nobody could. Jordan stood exactly where he had been standing for nearly an hour. The remarkable thing was that nothing about him had changed. Same hoodie. Same jeans. Same calm expression. The only thing that had changed was what people knew. Or thought they knew. A notification suddenly echoed through several company devices at once. Nicole looked down. then Daniel, then Richard. The messages were identical. Immediate operational directive. Executive review in progress. Preserve all records. Suspend discretionary actions. Richard swallowed hard. What does that mean? Nicole asked. Daniel already knew. His face said so. Hundreds of miles away, Marcus Carter's directive had moved through the company faster than turbulence through a storm front. Operations centers were reviewing reports. Compliance officers were examining timelines. Legal teams were requesting documentation. What began with 4 words had become an enterprise-wide review. Then another notification arrived. This one spread beyond a single aircraft. Flight managers across the network began receiving temporary hold instructions pending executive assessment. Aircraft at gates remained parked. Pushback clearances were delayed. Dispatch teams requested guidance. Nobody understood the full picture yet. They only knew something extraordinary was happening. Passengers inside the cabin began receiving delay updates through the airline application. Murmurs filled the aircraft. My connecting flight just changed. Mine too. What is going on? The answers remained hidden behind conference calls and executive channels. Jordan's phone vibrated. A new message appeared. Stay where you are. I am coming. Jordan read it once and slipped the phone away. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded to himself. Across the cabin, Emily noticed. So did several passengers. The certainty in his posture seemed impossible to miss now. Richard approached Daniel. His voice was barely audible. We did not know who he was. Daniel looked at him carefully. That is exactly the problem. Richard frowned. Daniel continued. Because none of this should depend on who he is. The words landed heavily. Nicole lowered her eyes. Nobody argued. The truth was sitting right in front of them. If Jordan had been anyone else, the questions would never have reached corporate headquarters. The review would never have happened. The flight would have departed, and the assumptions would have gone unquestioned. Another alert appeared across company systems. Emergency executive arrival confirmed. Local leadership report immediately. Suddenly the entire cabin felt smaller. The delay was no longer an inconvenience. It had become a reckoning. And somewhere beyond the terminal windows, a black sedan carrying Marcus Carter was already moving toward the airport. The cabin doors opened again just after 5 o'clock. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. The energy inside the aircraft shifted the moment Marcus Carter appeared at the entrance. He was dressed simply in a dark suit with no entourage and no display of status. Yet every person on board immediately understood who had arrived. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. Even the restless frustration that had filled the cabin for the past hour seemed to disappear. Marcus stepped onto the aircraft and looked directly toward the front galley. Jordan was still standing there. The father and son exchanged a brief glance. No dramatic reunion. No emotional speech. Just understanding. Marcus walked forward. Jordan nodded once. I am fine, he said quietly. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. I know. Then he turned toward the crew. Richard Collins looked as though he wanted to explain everything at once. Nicole Harris stared at the floor. Captain Daniel Pierce stood near the cockpit door waiting. Marcus remained calm. That calmness was somehow more powerful than anger could have been. I reviewed the reports, he said. I reviewed the gate records, the boarding records, the security logs, and the witness statements. Nobody interrupted. My son had a valid ticket, a valid seat assignment, a valid boarding pass. Yet he was removed from his seat and asked to justify his presence. Richard finally spoke. Sir, we did not know who he was. Marcus looked directly at him. Exactly. The words landed with the weight of a closing door. Because the issue is not that you failed to recognize my son. The issue is how you treated someone you thought did not matter. Complete silence followed. Around the cabin, passengers listened carefully. Emily Brooks sat motionless. Several people who had witnessed the entire incident exchanged quiet nods. Marcus continued. If respect depends on a title, then it is not respect. If dignity depends on a job description, then it is not dignity. Richard lowered his eyes. Nicole did the same. Captain Daniel stepped forward. Sir, corporate has already initiated a full review. Marcus nodded. As they should. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen briefly before placing it back into his pocket. The review had already expanded. Training procedures. Incident response policies. Passenger treatment protocols. Everything was being examined. Not because one teenager had been inconvenienced. Because one incident had revealed a larger problem. Marcus looked around the cabin one final time. This company moves millions of people every year. Some arrive wearing business suits. Some arrive wearing hoodies. Some travel in first class. Some travel in the last row of the aircraft. Every one of them deserves the same respect. Nobody disagreed. Nobody could. Then Marcus turned toward Jordan. Ready to go home? Jordan smiled for the first time all afternoon. Yes, sir. As father and son walked together toward the cabin door, the aircraft remained completely silent. Not because anyone had ordered silence. Because everyone understood the lesson. Jordan had never changed. The boarding pass had never changed. The facts had never changed. Only assumptions had. And sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make is confusing assumptions with truth. As they disappeared into the terminal, the cabin remained still, carrying with it a lesson that would outlast any delay. Marcus Carter never raised his voice that day. He raised the standard. And that made all the difference.